Hello and welcome to Film 2231, the Indigenous film. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about the importance of having Indigenous cinema. We specifically are focusing on the cultural significance of the film that we are going to watch for this week, Smoke Signals. Smoke Signal is a film that was released in less than 10 years after the release of Dances with the Wolves. And it shows a tendency in the younger generation of indigenous filmmakers to subvert the representational forms of the popular media that they themselves grew up with. This film has been widely used as a pedagogical tool in the discipline of indigenous studies in North American high schools, for example, as an introduction to real issues, more authentic representations of indigenous communities in North America. It subverts the over romanticized representations of Native Americans in Western films, specifically films like Dances with Wolves. The film, in a humorous way, refers a couple of times to Dances with Wolves and how it's a very different film. It's different than day-to-day experiences of how they experience lives in the communities. By avoiding that cultural fetishism, they bring in issues such as alcoholism, for example, in the indigenous communities in North America. In the same way, it is a familiar film. It is made within the culture of Western films. It's a road movie in a way. And that is something that may be referred by the readings that we had for today as a form of cultural currency. Dances with Wolves was a movie that subverts the character of the bloodthirsty Indian in Western films to a more sympathetic one, someone who is a friend of the hero. However, what the movie is really about is about the fact that indigenous characters couldn't survive. They belong to the past. They were cool. It's been over romanticized in different ways, but it's not a realistic representations of the obstacles and problem that the community encounter in day-to-day basis. In a way, natives were always made for films in white culture. They were exotic and erotic, so with all those feathers and that face paints, they were pleasant characters for generic Hollywood movies. But at the same time, those movies like Little Big Man and Dances with the Wolves should suggest that irrational community, that non-Christian community, cannot survive in a modern world. Nowadays, the images are even stamped on our currency or certain symbolic signs in Olympic or just the name of the cities and rivers. But again, it's always as something about the past, not a coexistence in terms of the present time. And in cinema, even when the story is taking place in a contemporary time, usually native characters or even they're casted, but they never play doctors or lawyers. They always play shaman. And it's something like the image that you can see in this bill. The image of the so-called dead Indians are becoming the only antiquity that North America has. And the problem is that modern indigenous people are not the exact copy. They are a bad copy of that cultural antiquity. A movie like Smoke Signals is trying to subvert that assumption, that dichotomy between the ancient Indians and the contemporary indigenous population, as if they are two different things. They are not connected. They were romanticized, but the contemporary ones never been even acknowledged. So a movie like that is trying to create that connection between the past and present. Because for Native people, the distinction between the so-called dead Indians and the live ones is almost impossible to be maintained, something that North America in general doesn't have any problem with. One is a romantic reminder of a heroic but fictional past. The other is simply an unpleasant contemporary surprise, like the alcoholic uncle character in A Smoke Signal. At the end, Indians that mainstream media shows, specifically Hollywood on the silver screens of North America, doesn't really have any resemblance with the actual native people. So native filmmakers are trying to change this, particularly through documentaries and more realist forms of entertainment. We are going to see actually contemporary films in this course, such as Blood Quantum, that they use more or less anti-realist aesthetic, but historically speaking, for economical reasons and also for the fact that they wanted to challenge the inaccuracies and stereotypical forms of representations, they were interested in documentaries and realist forms. Although we need to always remember that the documentaries are never real. The use of flashback and voiceover narration is very important in this film to connect the past and the present together, showing that how it's difficult to forget. Just this sentiment that let's forget the past is bygone, let's assimilate, let's coexist with each other is not easily possible. When we talked about sovereignty, like as it seems that the film is emphasizing on the political sovereignty for indigenous, we should know that it's a different forms of sovereignty. It's not really a nationalism or patriotism the way we know of in European democratic systems. For indigenous people, it's more like an intellectual sovereignty, or the term that is usually known as collective autonomy. The fact that people who live somewhere, they have a right to form a self-governance. So the film is very historically conscious when the flashback and the voiceover narration is recalling the community's past. In other words, the act of remembrance has been politicized. How residential school system was not really about assimilation. It was not really about accommodations of native kids into um, standard education in English. In fact, actually, if you read the literature, historical literature about residential school systems, indigenous people never had any problem with standard forms of education or learning English. But in residential school system, what was really the value was Christianity and working on farms. Both were alien to the native culture, specifically in Canada. We are going to watch a film by Jeff Barnaby that is specifically is focusing on this experience of residential school systems in Canada. But it's interesting actually to see how a number of different films made by Indigenous artists, such as this one, Smoke Signals, and also um, other forms of films, other genres of films, such as contemporary science fiction films, for example. I recently saw a movie by a filmmaker in Calgary that use science fiction, but at certain moment in films, it was kind of referring back to this act of remembrance and the wrongdoings of the past, focusing on the residential school systems. Also, more popular films such as Indian Horse or Rabbit Proof Fence. Rabbit Proof Fence is an Australian film, but again, this is the similar thing that is happening in Australia, Canada, and the United States. And all these films are in a very interesting way, always focusing in flashbacks. They always have flashback scenes focusing on the experience, the collective experience of a generation of native kids. Another film that was made before Smoke Signals was Dance Me Outside, 3 years after the release of Dances with Wolves. And it's a movie that, in a similar way, focuses on the experience of Native youth in Ontario. So the protagonist's sister has married to a white guy, so there's some sort of a role reversal. That guy needs to appropriate himself in that family. The movie also often uses black humor to show how they have been marginalized by the system.
Name?
Frank Fence Post.
Address?
Where do I live?
Yeah, where you live.
I live where the land meets the sky, where the eagle and the raven fly free. I live under the sun and the moon.
Where do you live? I'm his neighbor.
All of you, strip off. Even the boots. Now, if the lab matches Gaskell's blood to the blood on that...
So at the same time, you see the movie is a realistic portrayal of how youth were living in Ontario in the 90s. It uses this sort of dark humor to comment on their relationship to the land, how it's been taken from them. This relationship between the past and present, the dichotomy that I just said, is interestingly portrayed in the next scene when they are stripped out of their clothes. How the fact that they are naked, it looks like how they have been fetishized in movies such as Dances with a Wolf by white settlers as something both erotic and primitive. Kwasipan is another movie that tries to depict juvenile delinquency among native kids realistically. The film was made in 2019, and it has a realist look, like about the lives of teenagers in the community, but also it's going back to the broader questions of identity and the notion of remembrance in the community. So when watching the smoke signals, pay attention to all formal elements as well, like how the movie is edited, the use of mise-en-scène, the use of the sound, and the whole form of the film, as well as how the idea of racial otherness is played at, and more importantly, how the movie is trying to communicate with the way Hollywood movies have been portrayed, the native characters inaccurately. How the filmmaker has used irony and humor to detest the imperialist Western forms of representations.